Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to another edition of Fighting Game Thursday. Early in January of this year, we looked at an impressive fighting game with a unique visual presentation that was created using the power of silicon graphics. Rare's arcade game from 1994 plays an important role in the history of fighting games. So, for this reason, we are going to visit the world of Killer Instinct once again today. This time, looking at the game's sequel. Did the intellectual property wow arcade gamers a second time around? Well, let's find out by looking at the history of this game, its gameplay, and what makes the title stand out from others. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Killer Instinct 2. Yeah! To set the scene today, we quickly need to cover what was going on with Rare prior to the release of this game. Near the dawn of the 90s, after making a large portion of money developing games for the Nintendo Entertainment System, British company Rare would use this hard-earned money to invest in expensive silicon graphics computers in order to develop cutting-edge games. This purchase, paired with Rare's track record for success, would result in Nintendo buying a 25% stake in the company, essentially making Rare now a second-party developer for Nintendo platforms. Using the silicon graphic technology, Rare would first work on two new titles simultaneously. The first of these would be Donkey Kong Country, which would prove so popular that it would go on to become the second best-selling game on the Super Nintendo. The other was of course Killer Instinct. Rather than a home console game like Donkey Kong Country, Killer Instinct on the other hand would start its life out as an arcade game. Whilst the game was developed by Rare, the title itself was published by Midway and ran off of boards that were based off of a future upcoming Ultra 64 platform. Midway's partnership with Nintendo was in place due to Nintendo's belief that these arcade units would continue to build hype for the Ultra 64, and ultimately games made for the platform would later become Ultra 64 home console exclusives down the line. In fact, the impressive Killer Instinct, which featured pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds stored as movies, was even hyped that the game would be appearing in homes on the Ultra 64, with a release scheduled for 1995, which was touted within the arcade game's introductory sequence. Of course, this was never to be, due to the system receiving multiple massive delays, meaning that ultimately the first Killer Instinct game would arrive on the Super Nintendo, as opposed to the upcoming 64. Obviously, with the game seeing release on much more limited hardware, the game was severely scaled down from that of its arcade counterpart. But despite this, the game was still extremely impressive for a title that ran on 16-bit hardware, and as a result, proved popular and sold extremely well. In fact, Killer Instinct is still a game that many Super Nintendo owners still reminisce about playing up until this day. So, of course, with most gaming success stories, development of a sequel soon commences, and the story of Killer Instinct is no different in this regard. Apparently, Killer Instinct was always a title that a sequel was envisioned for. However, the assumption within Rare originally was that the game would be a home console exclusive. So whilst the first Killer Instinct game did appear in the arcades, this initially only occurred in the hopes that it would continue to build hype for the Ultra 64 platform. However, the game proved even more popular in cabinet form than the developers expected. So, like the first game, development of Killer Instinct 2 would begin life as an arcade game, with the intention of bringing the title home at a later date. As with all titles, as great as the first Killer Instinct game was, the developers never had the opportunity to squeeze everything into the game that they had originally intended. So some of the additions that were included in Killer Instinct 2 were ideas that were scrapped from the first game due to time constraints or space issues. The game was also programmed based on listening to consumer feedback from those who had played the first game and looked to improve on areas that were seen as a bit lacking. The game would be continuously refined throughout the duration of its development cycle, which would even include the game's artists creating additional animation frames right up until the final few weeks before the game's release. The game was worked on tirelessly by Rare employees. The game went through its final beta tests in late 1995, before finally seeing an arcade release in early 1996. Stakeholders in the game were keen to continue to make money off of this popular franchise. Personally, I would get my opportunity to play this game for the first time on holiday in Florida with my family back in 1996. The complex we were staying on happened to have a Killer Instinct 2 cabinet, which I spent a lot of money on. I was blown away with the game and had a lot of fun with this on the trip. I obviously would even fantasise about one day owning the title on my future Nintendo 64. I bloody loved this new game. Speaking of the future, nearly 20 years later in 2015, I was on another visit to Florida. I had been talked into visiting a location known as Westgate Lake Resort, where if I visited and listened to their timeshare pitch, they would give me free entry to all the Universal parks. This was obviously an offer I could not refuse, but not the most interesting part of this story. As soon as I made it to the reception area of this location, I quickly realised I was back in the exact same building where I experienced the glorious Killer Instinct 2 19 years earlier. However, sadly, the cabinet was no longer anywhere to be seen. But what a surprising nostalgia buzz that all was, nonetheless. With regards to the timeshare pitch, I would get my Universal tickets, but turned the offer down for the actual timeshare, as ridiculously the money they expected me to pay them monthly for their very average accommodation would have cost me more a month than it would to actually pay my monthly mortgage payments, and all that money would have just paid for somewhere to lie my head for just 2 weeks every year. Certainly an offer that was bespoke for people with more money than actual sense in their heads. But the Universal tickets and the Killer Instinct 2 nostalgia definitely made the short visit worth it, as I don't know whether these great memories would have been triggered without the experience. But is the game as great as I remember? Let's take a look. Like many fighting games, Killer Instinct follows a story narrative to give characters an actual reason to be trying to kill each other. Killer Instinct 2 follows exactly where the first game left off, which ends with the death of the game's last boss, Idol, which was at the hands of Orchid. This event accidentally sets off a time warp, transporting the tournament combatants back in time, allowing a demon lord known as Gargos to escape from Limbo. The original game survivors of the Killer Instinct tournament are now all trapped 2,000 years back in the past, along with some new faces who we shall get to shortly. Each of the characters in the game all have their own story arcs and different motivations for fighting. For example, TJ Combo just wants to return home, whilst other characters' main motivations is simply to end the game's new final boss's reign of terror. There is no tournament story here or grand prizes, just a huge fight with the fate of mankind hanging in the balance. As for this title's actual gameplay, much of the game's fighting is very similar to the entry's predecessor. Fights take place with two characters facing off, with the sole goal of depleting the opponent's life bars. Just like with the first game, mechanically the game differs in this aspect than with many other fighters, as rather than having a round system, if a character's life bar is depleted, they simply fall to the ground, then immediately get up and begin fighting with a second life bar. Victory is achieved when you deplete both of your opponent's bars. Once again, much like the first game, Killer Instinct 2 features an automatic combo subsystem within its contests, which revolve around a 3-strength system of quick, medium and fierce attacks. Mechanically, tweaks were made to the second game in the series, which would include normal moves losing some of their priority and range, as well as characters gaining extra recovery time. Throws were also added into the game, and characters can now be knocked over easier using normal moves. The main reasoning for this was to prevent the possibility of glitch combos and weakening the effectiveness of regular attacks. Certain special moves in this game are capable of breaking other special moves, similar to that of a game of rock, paper, scissors. Further to this, super bars were added to the game, similar to the meters found in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and the Street Fighter Alpha series. The super bars fill up as players take hits or when attacks are blocked by the opponent. Once the meter is filled high enough, multiple hit super moves are executable, which are extended versions of special moves. The combo system itself is still heavily based off the one that was featured within the first game in the series. With a simple press of the button, with the right openings, players can perform auto doubles and initiate the game's combo system. Players now have the ability to open up combos with less risky manoeuvres, such as with a fierce punch or kick. Super moves can also now be placed into combos, increasing damage and potency to sequences. Combos can also easily be extended by using throws and other simple techniques. All in all, the game has become more combo focused than ever before, which makes a lot of sense considering the combo system was one of the most dazzling features of the previous game. Speaking of the combos, another of the franchise's staples, combo breakers, were made even easier to perform, as combos are now broken depending on the type of attack. Punches break kick doubles, and kicks will break punch doubles. The ability to parry attacks was also added to the game, before Street Fighter 3 I may add. Basically, parry moves allow an open counter-attack after a successful parry block. According to the designer, Ken Lobb, eliminating excessive defense play was the absolute highest priority. I felt that this was not a problem for experts, but it hurt beginners. We now reward the aggressor big time. The title's finishing maneuvers have also been improved, in that they can now be executed when opponents' life bars go into the red, and a Mortal Kombat fatality-like system also made a return. However, Killer Instinct's fatalities are less crude, brutal, and do not feature any actual dismemberment. In terms of the playable fighters featured within this game, there are a total of 11 selectable fighters. The majority of the roster featured in the previous game make a return, however a few were omitted due to various reasons. The characters missing from this game include Idol, Chief Thunder, Cinder and Riptor, who are each replaced with 4 new characters, who we shall discuss now. Considering Orchid was by far the most popular character from the original game, it would make a lot of sense to add another female to the roster. This brings us to Maya Felgueiros, an Amazonian warrior who is from the time zone the game takes place in. She has defeated the game's main villain Gargos previously, but when he reappears in this game, she feels she has let her tribe down, so sets out to destroy him once and for all. Maya's revealing jungle bikini earned her a place among the worst dressed of 1996, according to Nintendo Power anyway. The magazine also nominated her Elephant Drop Ultimate Combo move for its That Gotta Hurt award. Very 90s. The game also features the Conan the Barbarian-like Tusk. Tusk wants to fight all challengers as he would like the pleasure of destroying Gargos himself. According to the in-game lore, Tusk actually marries Maya after the events of Killer Instinct 2, earning him some well-deserved snoo for the efforts. Once again, leading on from the success of Orchid, Kim Woo was added to the game's roster, a young East Asian ninja girl. She is a descendant of the people who repelled Gargos and Idol the first time around, and to protect her people, she sets out to stop Gargos once and for all. Finally, to round off the game's new fighters, we have the game's final boss himself, who is of course Gargos. We have already talked about him plenty, but to hammer him home, Gargos is a demon lord who has returned to the physical world. Himself and Idol were locked in combat for thousands of years prior to the events of the first game. Obviously, with the defeat of Idol in Killer Instinct's first entry, Gargos is ready to begin his new conquest, so must be stopped by the fighters at all costs. Like Idol in the original game, Gargos may be accessed as a playable character with the use of a cheat code. So, now we have talked about both gameplay and character changes to the game, let's talk about what wowed me the most, so much when I played this game for the first time all the way back in 1996. The game's amazing visuals, of course. The graphics and visuals in this game, like everything else, featured a major overhaul of its own. The title's rotational 3D multi-layered parallax backdrops were made to look even more diverse than before. With the game being set 2,000 years prior, everything in this game just looks a tad more, well, exotic and ancient looking. I guess as well, With the wealth of experience I would have had with the Super Nintendo version of Killer Instinct, by the summer of 1996, Killer Instinct 2 would have looked even shinier and more polished against it as a result. The game was pretty breathtaking looking for its time, and looked a lot cleaner than the existing 3D fighting games that were already in existence, such as Virtua Fighter and Tekken. Killer Instinct 2 featured a very different aesthetic, which personally I think has aged a lot better than early 3D polygon games. The game's great visuals were once again paired with a fantastic soundtrack, offering up consumers a perfect combo. See what I did there? Whilst, as mentioned, I was very clearly impressed with this game and could not wait to one day get it home. Video game critics' perspectives at the time were more mixed, with the game receiving more average reviews from them. Next Generation commented that, while the game includes new fighting elements such as the Super Bar, the essence of the original game is essentially recycled. They also criticised that, while the characters are large and more detailed, this is at the cost of the slower game speed and a choppier frame rate, summarising that, if you like the style of fighting that relies more on memorising combos than hand-eye coordination and, in a way, skill, Killer Instinct 2 is full of that same fighting style. They scored it 3 out of 5 stars. Despite reviews like this from the period, I find it quite rare to find someone who experienced this game with much negativity regarding it. If you ask me, the game was the perfect fighter for the mass market to appreciate. The game was beautiful, flashy, and had a barrier for entry low enough for most people to be able to pick up and play it. Looking back, the only real criticism you could really give the game is that it was not as complex as some other fighting games. But then again, the future of gaming would reveal that complex fighting games like Street Fighter 3 would not catch on with the mass market, like more simplistic games such as Tekken 2 would manage to achieve. So I feel some of the reception that Killer Instinct 2 got at the time was probably a little harsh. In regards to my dream of getting Killer Instinct 2 home, as time progressed that was looking less and less likely. Eventually in my own country I would receive Killer Instinct Gold on my Nintendo 64, which would be released in late 1997. I would receive the game for Christmas that year, and whilst many consider the game a port, I personally think too many changes were made to the title to consider the game as such. To top this off, the game would suffer from many graphical downgrades, which was a huge disappointment for me as a child, as Nintendo had hyped that the Nintendo 64 would be amazing, and the hype was now at such a level that they could not possibly deliver on it. Critics were as disappointed with the game as I was, who were expecting something much more impressive. The game is different enough in my opinion though, that if enough people enjoy this video, I'll do a standalone video on the history of Killer Instinct Gold. But for this content, I wanted it to be very much Killer Instinct 2 focused. Also, according to many websites I have browsed, Rare actually completely finished making a port of Killer Instinct 2 for the Super Nintendo, which has never seen the light of day. However, I can find no evidence to further substantiate this claim. Although I must admit, it will be an extremely exciting day if a ROM of such a title ever does come to light. Many moons later, the Killer Instinct franchise would be revived on the Xbox One, which is also a story for another time. But a digital port of the game for Xbox One would finally bring the arcade home in 2014. This port of the iconic game that had previously been locked to arcades came bundled with the second season of Killer Instinct 2013, under the title Killer Instinct 2 Classic. So now I guess the boyhood dream has finally come true, and we can all enjoy this title in the privacy of our own bedrooms. Fantastic stuff, eh? So I would say, up until 6 years ago, Killer Instinct 2 was one of the greatest and most iconic games that remained locked to the arcades for so long. The title took 14 years to finally make it home, which is a long time indeed for any arcade conversion. But I guess at least it was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. So I guess, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Killer Instinct 2, a game that had wowed me as a child. Let me know in the comment section which fighting game you would like to see me focus on next, and whether or not you are keen for me to cover Killer Instinct Gold, along with the Xbox One era of the series. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell to get regular content like this shared straight to your phone. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit, a shout out and producer credits at the beginning of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit easier, slightly less scary, so I would like to thank all of you very much for that. Huge thank yous go out to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, Sponge Matt B, JD Robin, Sint Spacies, Andrew Bazanski, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, Retroversion.com, House of a Ted, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah!